Welcome to part 2 of the Warframe Noobs series. This part, unlike the first, is actually going to be kicking this series off with some actual info. I'm going to be mentioning this at the start of every video. I'm not the best Warframe player by any means, but I am better than average, and I just want to get that out of the way, so if I get something wrong like a stat or something along those lines, feel free to correct me in the comments. Now that that's out of the way, we can jump into the main part of the video. Starting with your first option, you have Excalibur. This is one of the frames out of the three I have no experience with, but everyone I play with chose this one as a starter or crafted it later in the game, so I do have somewhat of an idea of how good it is. Starting with the base stats, you have 100 health, 100 shields, 100 energy, and 225 armor. Now this is pretty obvious what these stats are, but for those that don't know, health is obviously the amount of health you have, shields will usually be taken down before your health, and armor reduces the damage taken to your health, so the higher your armor stat, the better you'll survive when your shields are down. Energy is used to cast your abilities, so obviously certain abilities are going to cost a certain amount of energy, and you only have a certain amount of energy to begin with, so it's a resource that you have to use like ammo essentially. Your health and your shields and your energy all increase as your level goes up, and your armor can be increased with mods, which we'll get into in another video. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's get back to Excalibur. This Warframe has the highest base armor out of the three starting Warframes, and that goes hand in hand with the style of Warframe that it is. Excalibur is generally a tankish melee frame, or at least that's how I always see him being used. People get right up in the face of the enemies and just go ham with their sword, but obviously from the Warframe's name Excalibur, you could probably tell its abilities and strength in combat were going to be sword based rather than gun, but that's not to say that you can't pull out your Glock with Excalibur either. So his first ability Slash Dash allows him to quickly dash between enemies dealing damage. I don't see this used much, but it's there. Excalibur's second ability, which I actually see being used more often than not, is called Radial Blind. With this ability, Excalibur will raise his sword in the air and emit a flash of light that temporarily blinds enemies. Now, while the enemies are blinded, you can do basically finisher moves and stuff like that that deal a massive amount of damage. The third ability, which sounds badass and sadly I never see it get used, is called Radial Javelin. This ability launches javelins at enemies, impaling them to surfaces like walls, rocks, and the ground. Sadly, like I said, I almost never see this one get used. Excalibur's fourth and final ability, also the only ability that I constantly see being used, is called Exalted Blade. This ability allows Excalibur to summon a sword of light that deals massive damage. The cool thing about this ability is it's not normal melee. It sends out waves of energy that damage enemies. So you can sit back and just slash your sword while killing everything off in the distance, because every time you slash your sword, like I said, it sends out a wave of energy. Like I said, this is the ability that I see almost every single Excalibur user focus their build on, and for good reason. It does work in high level game, and obviously therefore in low level and mid level game as well. Excalibur also has a passive ability called Swordsmanship, which essentially gives you a bonus to speed and damage for using certain melee weapons, and also gives you a bonus to mods like Pressure Point and Fury, which further increase your attack damage and your attack speed. My final thoughts on Excalibur are, if you really enjoyed sword-based combat more than anything else, then grab this frame. Now you can get this one later on in the game, but it won't be till much later unless you find someone to help you get it. I do see this Warframe being used a lot in the late game, even more than the other two, so it might be beneficial to pick this one up and just have this one built and ready to go for when you get to the late game. That way you have something there as well. Moving on to the second option, you have Mag. I personally rank this as a mid-tier frame. It's good for low-level to mid-level enemies, but unless you have the perfect build, taking it into high-level missions isn't going to go so well. At least that's how my experience went with it. So Mag is a shield-based Warframe, with its shield starting out at 150 and ending at 450 at level 30, with its health stat starting at 75 and climbing all the way up to 225 at level 30, and the armor is a below-average 75. So you're going to be relying on your shields more than anything else to keep you alive. Mag's energy starts out at 100 and ends at 150 when you reach rank 30. Moving on to Mag's abilities, the first one is called Pull. Obviously from the name, it pulls enemies towards you, but it can also deal enough damage to kill enemies, and if it doesn't end up killing them, then it also stuns them for you. Her second ability is called Magnetize. This creates a small bubble around a single enemy that pulls nearby enemies into it and deals damage over time. Mag's third ability, called Polarize, emits an energy pulse upon casting it that will destroy enemy shields and armor, and after the shields and armor get destroyed, it creates shards that, if you mix this with your second ability, Magnetize, it can pull the shards into the bubble and deal even more damage over time. The third ability also restores the shields of any allies that get touched by the pulse. Mag's fourth and final ability is called Crush. Crush. This one temporarily picks up enemies and crushes their bones that deals massive damage over time. Just like the third ability, this one can be combined with your second. Any enemy that is affected by your second ability, Magnetize, will take additional damage from your fourth ability, Crush. And Mag's passive ability is called Magnetic Attraction. This pulls any of the nearby drops to her and collects them when she bullet jumps. If you don't know what a bullet jump is, you basically just crouch and then jump in whatever direction you're looking at. So to bullet jump forward, you would just crouch, look forward, and then jump. My final thoughts and personal experience with Mag are, it's definitely a fun frame to use, but once you get into the higher level areas, it felt more like a burden than actually being helpful. I do recommend this if you're just looking for something fun, but if you just wanted to wreck face, then after a certain point, you're gonna hit a barrier and Mag won't be as useful. But like I said, if you're running mid-level missions, it is fun to use. The third and final Warframe is Volt. Volt's stats are kind of a mix between Excalibur and Mag, meaning Volt has Mag shields and Excalibur's health, although Volt's armor rating was completely thrown out the window with only 15 base armor. Volt, just like the others, starts out with 100 power and ends at 150 when you hit level 30. Now, I personally use Volt in a variety of ways. You can use it to sit back and target enemies with guns, or you can get up in the enemy's faces with extremely fast sword hits. Volt's first ability is called Shock. This ability sends out an electric projectile that stuns enemies and deals damage over time. This ability can also be changed to enemies that are near its original target. Volt's second ability, called Speed, is where I tend to use my melee the most. This ability gives Volt and his allies a short speed buff for everything. That includes running, walking, reloading, melee, you name it. Sadly, the duration from the start makes it kind of useless, but enhanced with mods, it turns into one of Volt's best abilities. Volt's third ability is where I personally like to use my guns more than anything else, and with good reason. The ability is called Electric Shield. Volt places an energy shield down in front of him that increases the critical hit damage of Volt and his allies, as well as normal damage. While the normal damage bonus can be stacked up to 3 times by placing 3 shields in a row and shooting through them, sadly the critical hit bonus does not stack, but it's still a 200% critical bonus, so that's nice. And in case the name of the ability didn't clarify it, yes, it does block enemy damage while it's active. Volt's fourth and final ability is called Discharge. This one is much like the first, but instead of a single projectile, it sends out a wave of electricity that stuns and damages multiple enemies. The fourth ability can be combined with the first ability to create an overcharge, which will send out another wave of electricity depending on the target. Volt's passive ability is called Static Discharge. For every 1 meter Volt travels, 5 points of electricity damage is accumulated up to 1000 points, which will add bonus damage to Volt's next attack. So my final thoughts for Volt are, unlike Mag, I do see Volt being used quite a lot in the higher level missions. Not as much as I see Excalibur, but definitely more than Mag. And I can say from personal experience that Volt is basically an all-around Warframe, so you basically get in the best of both worlds with Volt. And what I mean by that is, if you want to do melee attacks, you can combine melee with your second ability, which will make you do really fast melee attacks, and then if you start to take a lot of damage, you can just speed the hell out of there. And then if you want to use guns, like I said, you got your little shield, which increases gun damage, so that's nice. And then also Mag, which would be an ability-based Warframe, where you're going to be using your abilities a lot. Volt has that too with its first and its fourth ability, so you're basically kind of getting an all-around Warframe here. But my final thoughts on all 3 choices are to just pick what seems like the most fun to you. Warframe is much like Pokemon in the sense that, while you can get one OP Warframe and only use that, the odds of you ending up with like 5 or even 10 Warframes that you constantly switch between are very high. So I would say don't pick based on what is the best. Pick based on if you're going to have fun with it. Like I said at the start, you can get all 3 of these Warframes later on in the game through crafting, so don't feel obligated to pick one because it's better than another. But that's basically going to do it for this video. Hopefully it helped. If you haven't checked Warframe out yet, I'll leave a link in the description for the PC version. It's free to play, and it's also on Xbox and PS4 for free to play as well. Other than that, if you liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. If anyone has any tips with using the first 3 Warframes, feel free to drop them in the comments. And if you want to stay up to date with the series, feel free to subscribe. But with that, I don't have an outro, so we'll just fade to black.